it's Katie. This is probably my 7th take because I'm so tired. But let's get into what is Asian America. I first wanted to talk about what I found interesting in the Takaki ratings, and that specifically was the creation of Chinatowns and how we started to see ethnic communities at large start to pop up. And ultimately, I saw, where's the page? We see things to honor gods. We see the focus of Asian cuisine and, having this place to commiserate and not think about the outside white American looming bubble, for lack of a better word. And specifically, we also see in this Takaki chapter about the role that women played. And it's interesting, but also kind of detrimental in a way to talk about the fact that women were objectified and their roles were mainly that of prostitution, and how Takaki even mentioned when asked to write down their occupation, women would often just write prostitution, and it's nothing like we would see today where we have options of like doctor, professor, author. Those weren't viable options back then, and we see this as kind of the start of many waves of women being objectified, along with ethnic group immigration, and how we as women were never quite equals with men, and how we didn't have rights, and how our voices weren't as often heard or taken seriously, for that matter. But let's get into the secondary source. So for this, I chose to talk about Tongans in Utah because I thought that was a very interesting week, and specifically because I haven't seen the representation of Tongans and Samoas as much as the very typical conversations of Chinese, Japanese immigration and what that looks like. But it was interesting to see how Samoan and Tongan immigration was rooted in Mormonism and I guess religion on a bigger scope, and how the missionaries played a part in kind of uplifting these communities to come together and specifically find a hub in Utah, which is, when you think about it, kind of, not the first place that comes to mind, because it's not necessarily on the direct coastline. But in the article, I was talking about how there was affordability and so many more opportunities specifically with education, they felt really motivated to go to a place that they felt like they would belong. And I think at the end of the day, that kind of is the goal for so many people, not just Asian Americans, but finding a place where you belong and you feel supported is really important. And so that kind of played into a lot of immigration stories, nonetheless. So, as for my primary source, I know we didn't necessarily talk about Professor Ibanez's book, but I found a photo in here that I thought was pretty cool. And it's this photo of some Filipino men and some Caucasian women, and they look like they're having a nice photo shoot. And I wanted to connect this to the discussions we had about gender stereotypes regarding Filipino men, specifically how they kind of, pave this way for a classier image of themselves and how they are becoming more desirable. And, we're not just allowed to date within our own ethnic group, And I'll read the comment. So it says, many of these young Filipino men of the 1920s and 1930s were sharp dressers, were muscular from working hard, and had a style that women found attractive. And I just think they look really dapper and so sure of themselves too. Like, you can tell the confidence is there, and they just have it. They just have the flaunt, and they just know. It gives Great Gatsby, because that was, the 20s and 30s. Anyway, the last thing I think I'll get into is our lecture discussions about pop culture, because obviously that's really fun and that's really important to talk about, specifically because it relates to relevancy of younger generations and kind of the future. So in our conversations about pop culture, we talked a lot about representation and visibility and whether or not we actually really see it. I think that was a main question that we brought up in our discussion quite a bit. Do we actually see it? And if we do, what does it look like? And I think we still see, okay, I'm gonna still be talking about gender, but it's still important. But we talked about how Asian American women in some older films were usually just tokens for white men, and how, again, we perpetuated this idea that women can only really act as prostitutes, and that is their role, and that we shouldn't stray from that. Luckily, we are a little bit past that. We see actresses like Michelle Yeoh starring in so many different things, and I mean, that's just one example, and of course the only example that came to my mind, but we still have a ways to go, I would say. We can't just wait for things like Crazy Rich Asians to, take the cake for Asian representation. Even things like Parasite, which was still a really good film. It shouldn't just be the model. We shouldn't have just one role model film that we refer to as Asian American representation. It needs to be more widely spread across the board. But overall, I think I had a good time in this class, and thank you, Professor Fortune, for a great semester.